Good morning and welcome back to week 2 of the DRK March to May Knit Along Q&A. It's a mouthful. So I'm going to jump right in because we've got some lengthy questions today and I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. So first question, how did you learn to put your patterns into writing? Did you get some formal training or was it a learn as you go process? So I actually went to culinary school for healing diets, and then I went to cosmetology school, and I also did a little traditional college in there too. So I did not get any formal training in this. Basically, I was just a very avid knitter. I learned when I was about 9 from my grandma, and then I got really into it and kind of obsessed when I was a teenager. So when I really jumped back in, it was pre-Ravelry, so there wasn't access to patterns like there is now. So most patterns you would end up knitting would be either from knitting books or maybe knitting magazines, something maybe you'd pick up from your local yarn store. So thankfully I stumbled upon Elizabeth Zimmerman and got her books when I was young, and she's just, the way she would write was incredibly empowering. You know, she gave you vague instructions and you just did it and kind of created your own thing. So she would tell you, here's your gauge. And, you know, the first pair of socks I ever knit, I made up the pattern with her guidelines. So I think that it just was a little bit intuitive for me because of the way that things were when I started. And then after years of following other people's patterns and just really loving knitting, I thought, you know, I have ideas that I'm not seeing out there that I would love to, you know, to knit these things. And so I thought I would give it a try. And I just started small. I think that's one of my biggest recommendations. You know, I think there are some people who are just sweater knitters, that's just who they are, but designing a sweater is going to be the most complicated place to start because you need to put it in sizes for all different body shapes. So for me, I started with a pair of mittens and then a hat, and then I did a little collection that was a hat and a stole and a scarf. So I started off with things that felt a little easier to figure out, okay, this is how I think I'll lay out the pattern. I think I can write this in a way that it'll make sense to other knitters. And I do think it helped that I used to be a chef because I would write recipes, and writing knitting patterns is actually really similar to writing recipes. So I think I kind of was comfortable in that way. But yeah, I think you just kind of got to jump in and see what happens. I also, let me grab it. 1 second. Drink your coffee, your tea. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. So what I wanted to grab was, I get a lot of questions about my knitting journals, and I think that this actually helped with the way I write patterns. Is what I would typically do when I was following somebody else's pattern is I've always had little, I like spiral bound ones because they lay flat, but I would always rewrite the pattern so it was easy and intuitive for me to follow, or especially if I was knitting a sweater, I would just kind of like write my size so I didn't have to look at any other numbers, and I knew if I wanted to knit it again that I would have everything perfect for the next one. So like one of my favorite tricks, which we're going to talk about a little later too, is with sleeve knitting. I like to write down all the rows I'm gonna decrease on, or the rounds, and that way when I do my second sleeve, I just have my row counter and I don't have to measure, I don't have to count, like I just know exactly where to place those decreases. So that's some of the stuff I would write in my little notebook. I'm trying to see if I can show you. I obviously don't want to show anything that would give away somebody's pattern. But here is, you know, like I would write like, okay, I'm casting on this many stitches, And I would even write, so like here's all the abbreviations for the different cables, and here's my repeat decreases. So I'd write exactly the rows I was decreasing on. Yeah, so anyways, I think that helped me. And you can see, I mean, these are all, this whole notebook is just patterns. And then it actually goes into when I started having my ideas and sketching. I have some people ask if I put like swatches, if I catalog my swatches. I don't. I have basically a giant bin of swatches, and I hang some on my wall. But I'm not that great at organizing my swatches. So anyways, there we go. So it was definitely a learn as you go process. I started small and I built up towards doing things like sweaters. And I very much am a tactile person. So for me, it was just really intuitive to try it. If it didn't work out, I ripped it out. And that's the way my mind thinks. There are some designers who write a pattern and then they knit it. For me, I write as I go. So I started off with having like my laptop open next to me because I was so afraid of writing something wrong. But now I just carry around my notebook and I jot down notes. And then once I'm totally done, I go back and write the pattern. So, question 2. When knitting a sweater, how do you determine increases or decreases when stitch gauge matches but the row gauge doesn't? I made a sweater and tried to figure out how to change the sleeve decreases, but I didn't do it correctly and my sleeves were too long. I rarely can match both stitch and row gauge. It's very frustrating. So I'm gonna focus on the sleeve part of this question because it is tricky. I personally try to write my patterns to a measurement as far as rows go instead of knit 7 rows, because I know, like, I typically it's always going to depend on the pattern, but most patterns stitch gauge tends to be a bit more important than row gauge because you can knit to, let's say, 3 inches instead of having to knit to an exact number of rows. There's exceptions to that, of course, but sleeves are also something that are pretty common to want to modify that length. Maybe you know you don't like having a sleeve that goes over your hand, or you can't stand if it's too short, or we all have different length arms. So sleeves are pretty easy to modify that length. So to figure out that math, basically what you want to do is you want to look at your schematic, and it's going to tell you how long they think the sleeve should be. And then you can determine, well, I want it to be longer or shorter than that. So if I wanted this sleeve to be, let's say, 18 inches, I would first want to check how long the cuff is, because you're not going to decrease in that cuff typically. And so then I would go, okay, so this cuff's about 2 inches. So that tells me from underarm to where my cuff starts, I've got 16 inches. So, and this actually has a exception because we have color work here, and if we're following a pattern that has a chart, we don't want to mess with that stitch count either, so we wouldn't want to decrease within that chart either. So I would take off, let's say this is 1 inch, so I'd be like, okay, so I have to get to my stitch count 3 inches instead of the 2. So 18 minus 3 would be 15. So then you have to look at, okay, you can do some simple math. You know your gauge because that's going to be in your pattern. So take your gauge, let's say it's 4 stitches to the inch. Okay, I know that I want my cuff to be 10 inches, so I need 40 stitches down there. So I would take whatever number of stitches I have cast on for my upper sleeve. And I'm doing top down in this example, but it works in either direction. You would just be adding stitches instead of subtracting. And I would take 4, or whatever that number of stitches is, minus 40. So let's say it's 20 stitches. Well, you're going to decrease 2 stitches every round. So you can divide the stitches you're removing by 2, and that's how many decrease rounds you get. So that would be 10 rounds. So now I just have to do my 15 inches divided by 10, 1.5. So I need to space those every 1.5 inches. Now to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room there, I actually take off about 1/2 inch on either end. That way I know I'm not gonna overshoot it. So I might even say, actually, instead of doing it out of the 15 inches, I'm gonna give myself just a window of 14 inches. That way I know I'm getting all my decreases done. So I'm gonna do 14 divided by 10 decrease rounds. And I'll write a little note down right below the video with some of those equations for you so you can kind of plug in those numbers. But after you've tried it a few times, it's pretty simple math to do. Obviously, it gets trickier if there are stitch patterns are all up and down the sleeve. But that's what I do. This is the bean and olive sweater, by the way, if you're wondering. All right, blocking. I'm fairly new to knitting. I have not blocked a single piece. I'm daunted by it and don't know where to start. Should it be done with every finished object or just certain pieces? What's the difference between light and heavy blocking? What are the pros and cons of T-pins and the specialized combs? What surface should the piece lie on? Should the liquid just be water or a little soap? Great questions. So for blocking, the way that I do it is I run as warm a bath as I feel comfortable with without obviously wanting to felt my knits. Now, I never agitate my knits. Sorry, there's a truck on the street. So I'm pretty comfortable running a fairly warm bath because of that. Now, if you're worried about felting, if you're worried about color bleeding, then stay on the cool side of that temperature. So I fill up whatever it may be, a sink, a tub. We have like a little tub in our laundry room that I use. And I put a little wool wash in there. You could also just use a little essential oil, whatever you prefer. I like a wool wash. Typically they have a little lanolin in them, and I just really like how they make my woolens feel. So I fill up the water with a little bit of wool wash, and then I just plop my knit in there, and because I choose to use warmer water, I just very gently help push it down a little bit, but I'm not poking, prodding, squeezing, anything like that. The reason I do prefer to use warmer water is because it can really get in and saturate that knit, which will really help with the blooming effect. If you don't know what I'm talking about with blooming, it is the yarn has gone through so much. It's been sheared off of a sheep. It has been cleaned and carded and spun and then wound into a cake and then knit by us. So once we give it a bath, it lets the yarn just relax. And then a lot of times that yarn will kind of just like expand and fill in. Having never, as you said, you've never tried blocking any of your knits, it will change your knitting life. So I did not block my knits for years. I know. I just didn't really understand what it would do to the knits. So I learned after I knit a couple cabled items. So things that have cable patterns, lace patterns, they cannot come to their full beauty without blocking because they're tied up and squished and they need to be opened up, and you need to do that by blocking. So I had knit a sweater and a hat that were cabled, and I actually ended up giving them away because they were so ill-fitting. Well, I didn't realize if I had blocked them, they would have had this beautiful open drape that they didn't have fresh off my needles. So you do want to block your knits because it'll totally change how they look. They will be so beautiful. So I let them soak for anywhere from 15 minutes to a few hours because I forget about them. You really want to let them soak long enough that that yarn can be completely saturated right down to its core. So don't just like stick it in, pat it a little bit and pull it back out. Really do let it soak. Then I drain the water and I very gently squeeze as much out of that knit as I can. You want to be careful if you're doing something that might stretch a lot, like a sweater sleeve or brioche or something that waterlogged, it's gonna weigh it down. So I really gently, almost like a little baby, like pick it up and kind of squeeze all that water out as much as I can. Then I lay down a clean towel, put my knit on that and spread it out, lay another dry towel on top, and then I roll it up and I stand on it. And I might do that once more if it's really saturated, just to get out as much moisture as I can. And then I lay it flat to dry. So I really love blocking mats because you can pin into them. If I am blocking a sweater, I'll show you real quick. I have over here, this is from, if you're new to blocking, Coco Knits has a sweater blocking kit that I got, and this is part of it. And it's this hoop that opens up and you buckle it, and it creates this to lay, it's like a giant Pringle to lay your sweater on. And that's really nice because you'll have airflow all the way around it. But you wouldn't want to pin into that. So that's what I use when I'm refreshing a sweater. If I'm blocking anything that I want to pin out, I always use my blocking mats. And in general, I'll use a blocking mat unless I want it to dry a little quicker, and then I really like that mesh Pringle thing. So as far as also surfaces for it to be lying on, back when I first started blocking knits, and I think a lot of people still do this, they would block on top of towels. You don't want to block on top of towels or fabric at all, because what happens is it's gonna just soak up the moisture and keep your woolens wet longer. So you don't want to block on top of towels because it'll take a really long time to dry and will probably not smell great at the end. So that's why you want to do something like a blocking mat. If you don't have blocking mats, it's totally fine. What I would do is maybe lay a garbage bag over towels or over the end of a bed or on a rug. If you have a guest room, you can throw it in, and then lay your knits on top of that. The nice thing is if you have something soft underneath, you can still pin if you need to, and the garbage bag is actually going to force that water to evaporate because it can't absorb it. So that's my recommendation. As far as T-pins and those little combs, I think they're called knit blockers. I have both of those and I use them for different reasons. So I definitely think you'll always need a couple T-pins because sometimes you're just blocking out something small. But I do really like the knit blockers because it's basically a whole bunch of T-pins on one comb. And if you're trying to get a straight edge, I actually have a sweater blocking right now that I would show you all, but it's a secret one. And I used it to pin out the bottom hem of the sweater in around the collar and just keep it nice and straight. And it's so much faster than doing a million individual little T-pins. If you're really into lace, you might also want to consider getting some blocking wires because those you can feed through your knit and then pull for even tension and then use a couple T-pins to stabilize it. In regards to things like pins and blocking wires, anything metal that you're going to be putting into your knits, you really do want to make sure you're getting ones that are meant for this, because I have heard some horror stories about people grabbing a thin wire from Home Depot, or they accidentally used sewing pins and those weren't rust proof, and so they ended up with rust in their hand knit because of the moisture. So be careful on that note. And then you just let it dry completely and pull it off. But it will really change your knitting. You'll be amazed. And then I actually had another question that I'm gonna go right into because it has something to do with this. So when you wear and wash your hand knits, do you block them the same way every time as when you block a newly finished item? Or is there a faster way to do it as the garment settles into its shape? So the first go round, I really give it some love. I always say, I think people expect the blocking of their piece to be really fast, but I give myself an hour, especially if it's something like a shawl that needs blocking wires. I give myself a pretty good window of time. So I just saw the time. I gotta hurry this one up. So The first time I am all in. I really take my time to do it nicely, especially because there's something like a shawl. You're probably not going to have to block again for a very long time. So I put that time in, and with the first time I do a sweater. But yes, from there on out, I do I wash it the same way by putting it in the tub of warm water with some wool wash. And then I typically use that mesh Pringle and wet block it, just lay it flat to dry like you would if you had a hand washing store-bought sweater that's hand wash only. So, and then I just pat it into its shape and dry. It does seem to settle in, so I don't feel like you have to worry about it too much from there. All right, we're already at 20 minutes, so I'm gonna end this one here, but I will post the questions I've answered below, so if you want to see them written out, you can. Today I'm wearing my Comfort Fade Cardi. The Grocery Girls are starting a knit along with Labiata May that kicks off today, so I will include a link to that, and you can double dip. You can participate in their knit along, and you're more than welcome to bring it on over to the DRK sweater knit along as well. Magpie Fibers just started another knit along. They are doing a beav along. They have all these beaver named yarns, and so if you use a DRK pattern over there as well, again, feel free to double dip if it's a shawl or a sweater over in the March to May knit along. Thank you so much for coming back, or if it's your first time, welcome. You can check out the video for last week, and remember to send me your questions. I will include that below as well, the Google form you can fill out if you have a question you're curious about, along with my newsletter link. So I hope you all have a great weekend and happy knitting.